This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 457, Drupal Architecture. This episode of Talking Drupal is sponsored by Hero Devs. On today's show, we're talking about Drupal architecture, common site building questions, and how we solve things with Drupal with our guest, Alexander Varwijk. We'll also cover Drupal 10.3 as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Alexander Varwijk. Alexander is technical architect at OpenSocial, where he uses his over 12 years of Drupal experience to provide teams with guidance of how best to leverage Drupal and its ecosystem, and to point out when Drupal may not be the right solution. In his spare time, he enjoys gaming, cycling, watching Formula One, and reading books on programming, business, finance, and mental well-being. He's currently trying to get Drupal core to adopt the Revolt event loop. Alex, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us 100 episodes after your first appearance on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's really nice to be back.
So before we go on, what is the Revolt event loop?
So the Revolt event loop has to do with basically async programming. So one of the initiatives that Cache has been driving within Drupal core is the adoption of fibers to make more work within Drupal run in parallel. But one of the things you run into when you start doing that is that you have to orchestrate different things that might want processing time at the same time. And what you see if you do that manually is that you get a lot of these orchestration loops in different places throughout the code base, essentially, that don't play nicely together. The Revolt event loop was created by a collaboration between AMP.PHP and React.PHP, which are two of the larger async PHP frameworks. And they've decided to standardize on the event loop, which basically sits at the bottom of your application to do that scheduling for you. So to take all of those tasks that could run concurrently and make sure that they get time to run on the CPU when there's something for them to do.
Wow. All right. That feels like a whole episode in and of its own.
It definitely could be, yes.
Oh man. All right. Well, maybe we'll do that. Hopefully not in 100 episodes, maybe a little bit sooner than that.
So if you're curious about more of this and why async is important for the future of Drupal, I'm actually giving a talk about this at DrupalCon Barcelona. So if you're already going there, then yeah, come to my session and find out more.
There you go. I'm John Picozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM, and today my co-hosts are joining us for the next 4 weeks. Batty Sonia Baidert. So Batty has been with us before as a guest, is now joining us as guest host, is the CEO and co-founder of 1X Internet, a European Drupal agency with offices in Germany, Iceland, and Spain. She has been on the board of directors for the Drupal Association for the past 6 years, reaching her term limit, and is now part of the executive committee as a past chair. Batty is Icelandic, has a degree in computer science and engineering, and has been working with Drupal since 2007. Batty, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you, Alex, for promoting DrupalCon Barcelona happening in the end of September did I have to pay for this or? Extra?
No, we do it. We do it for free. You get free self-promotion and Drupal promotion always. And last but not least, Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development. Welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
Alrighty. And now to talk about our core update of the week, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules and recipes of his own. Martin, tell us all about Drupal 10.3.
Thanks, John. Have you been wanting to use workspaces, single directory components, recipes, or the new admin menu in your Drupal site? The new Drupal 10.3 release is better for using all of these and more. It was tagged on June 20th by Catch of Tag 1 and 3rd and Grove. And in this new minor version, Workspaces is now declared stable, and single directory components are now fully integrated into core instead of being in an experimental module. Drupal 10.3 also includes the new Access Policy API that was funded as part of the Pittsburgh process kicked off at DrupalCon Pittsburgh. As part of that, the super user access policy that automatically grants user one every permission can now be turned off in services.yaml, and the recipes and new navigation menu are available as experimental features. The Actions UI, Book, and Statistics modules are now deprecated, and contrib projects are available for all of those. Install profiles can now be uninstalled on your Drupal site, and new sites can be installed without any profile at all. 10.3 also includes a new revision UI for taxonomy terms, and they can also be used with content moderation. All core provided image styles now include WebP conversion, and the state service now uses a cache collector for performance, which requires opt-in within settings.php for existing sites. There are other performance improvements, including post requests are now rendered cacheable, duplicate queries during logins are avoided, and big pipe requests are now avoiding reading the session data from the database multiple times. With 10.3, developers can also make use of a new AJAX command to open a URL in a dialog, and a new draggable list builder trait, among a host of other changes. Of course, there are also some additional deprecations, so the project update bot has already been busy creating new MRs on the various contrib projects. So let's talk about the Drupal 10.3 release.
Oh boy, do I have things to say, because I updated my site to 10.3 just at the beginning of this week, so like I guess yesterday. And I've been using navigation for a while, so I'm super excited that it's in core. It is experimental, so if you turn it on, just be aware it's experimental. But yeah, I really do love the new navigation menu there. And as far as deprecations go, I did get some warnings about deprecations, one of which I don't know that it's listed here, but it has something to do with Layout Builder, which I use Layout Builder, and I removed the module and everything was fine. So all good there. But yeah, 10.3 is great.
That's a lot of new goodies. It feels like the releases are getting bigger and bigger with more every minor release. It's amazing.
I think part of that has to do with the needs review queue initiative as well. I mean, listeners of the show know this. I've called this out a few times, but Stephen Musgrave's work with that initiative has helped like unblock and increase velocity. So I think that helps a lot. But personally, I'm very excited for 10.3 because it's the first release where I've added new features to Drupal itself and made the install process simpler too. So if you're installing Drupal after 10.3, you no longer have to specify the default country, which is a setting that has done nothing since I think like 8.4. So it's a drop down that you no longer have to set. You can still set it if you need to on the regional form, so in the settings, if you have a module that is using it, you can still set it. But the one that I'm more excited about is an accessibility fix, which allows you to now set, it's not going to hit everywhere, but it's one thing that, I'm happy to have contributed, but you can set the heading level for pagers now. So they used to be hard-coded at H4s, which...
Is that why all my views updated in my config? Because I was like, I literally got all those config changes, and I'm like, I bet this was because of Nick.
You have no idea how much work goes into updating views config. In fact, there's an issue right now to help document the views config updater because it's so complex, and possibly modify it maybe in the future to help with generalized config updates, because updating config is painful. But anyway, you can now, it's now an option that you can configure. If you did use starter kit, you do need to copy the views mini pager and the pager HTML templates back over because there's a new variable. But you can now set that heading level in configuration and make your site just that much more accessible.
So I do actually have a question. I don't know if anybody, because 10.3 is so brand spanking new. I don't know. Has anybody tried to uninstall a profile and install a new one, or set up a site without a profile?
No, but
I'm
that's
just
on my
curious.
list.
Oh,
I'm just curious of what that looks like, because I feel like that's both awesome and very exciting to me, but also kind of terrifying, because I imagine, like, I don't know, imagine it being weird.
It's mainly for the recipes initiative, so that
Yeah,
people
of course.
can
Yep.
kind of start from scratch without being tied into something.
Makes sense.
We might try it at Open Social in the future. So we do actually ship an install profile now, but if I think about what is included in it, it is very small amounts of config, because most of our config lives in modules. And the most important part is actually the custom installer, which changes how we install some of the modules, which we helpfully borrowed from the Thunder distribution. So I think it's going to be interesting to see, like, if we install without a profile, can we still get those installer steps in there? And if the answer is yes, then that would provide us with a path to remove the rest of the profile, essentially.
Cool. One gotcha, I will say, because I know we've done a few shows on AI and we've talked about ChatGPT, and I installed the ChatGPT module. I think I might have talked about this on the show. Maybe I didn't, but I installed it on my site a couple of weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago at this point. But I will say there is a bug. There will be a link in the show notes that if you have the ChatGPT integration installed, and then you have the CK editor integration module, submodule installed there, your body fields disappear. So just be aware that's out there. It was a shock to me the other day when I went to go edit my blog, and I was like, where'd my body field go? Thought it actually had to do with autosave, because I had just added that module, and I was like, oh no, but tracked it back to, the CK editor integration for the ChatGPT integration module. That's a lot of integrations, but link in the show notes so you can check that out. Luca, who has been on the show before, had already put a ticket in there, but it doesn't seem like anybody's really taken a look at it. So hopefully somebody can jump in there and help out to resolve that.
One final question then. If so, related to the navigation menu, does that mean that the admin toolbar module will have seen its last use?
So
Because if we're talking about site building, that's basically one of the modules I first install on any project.
Yeah, so you don't need the toolbar module anymore to have the navigation, which is I don't know. It's nice because you can literally spin up Drupal and, like, the navigation just works, and it has all of the kind of pop outs that you would expect, which is awesome, because you're definitely not the only one who would install, admin toolbar every time, because it was provided that those drop downs and whatnot. I will say along the navigation terms, because on my personal site I had navigation already, I did have to do an uninstall and reinstall there just to kind of get things working and update the configuration. But that was about it with that during the upgrade process.
So one thing I'll mention before we finish talking about 10.3 is that this is expected to be the last feature release for Drupal 10. So in a little over a month's time, we're expecting the release of Drupal 11. And then after that, all new features will be going into the Drupal 11 branch.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think so. And the interesting thing about 10.3 being the last feature release and there being 10.4 is there's actually an issue in core trying to figure out how to handle update hook divergence between 10.4 and 11.0 because they're both going to be out at the same time and may require the same update hook but be different numbers. And so if you're interested in that kind of thing, there's an issue for that. We'll put that in the show notes too.
So earlier you mentioned that Drupal core was looking at how to ease config updates. And that's actually, as a distribution, something we've already been doing. So I was curious to know which issue that is and make sure it got included in the show notes, because we've been using Update Helper, which was also something we helpfully borrowed from the Thunder distribution.
Yeah, I'll track that down and make sure it's in the show notes.
Well, Martin, thank you as always for providing us a on point module or core update of the week in this case. If folks wanted to suggest a module, where and how could they do that?
We are always happy to get nominations for Module of the Week in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly as Man Clue on all of the Drupal and social channels.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
This episode of Talking Drupal is sponsored by Hero Devs. Let's talk about life after Drupal 7 end of life. Since August 2023, there's been a lot of discussion around Drupal 7's official end of life in January 2025. It's no secret that many companies, organizations, and individuals are still on Drupal 7 and have yet to migrate. I think we can all agree that migration, while beneficial, is not always feasible. This is where Hero Devs comes in. Hero Devs has partnered with core team maintainers of Drupal 7 to build and maintain their Drupal 7 never-ending support product, ensuring the same quality of support you have come to expect over the years. Drupal 7 never-ending support, or NES, allows for an effortless transition, allowing your site to remain secure, compliant, and compatible after Drupal 7 goes end of life. This allows for you to migrate on your own time, or potentially not at all. Hero Devs promises to keep Drupal 7 alive and well, even offering support for the current top 100 Drupal 7 modules. If you'd like to know more about Drupal 7 never-ending support, visit herodevs.com. That's HERODEVS.com. Now, on to our primary topic. Okay, so Alex, there are hundreds, if not millions, of ways to build a Drupal site or Drupal solution when you're getting started with a project, or maybe just adding features to a current project. I'd like to know, just at a high level, where do you start when you're thinking about the architecture of building a site or building a feature into a Drupal site?
So I think for me, it usually starts with talking to our product owner and making sure that we talk to the customer, but also to our designer. And I think one of the questions I usually start with, which sometimes annoys people, is if this could be as big as we want, or if we would have as much time as we want, how would it look and how would it evolve? Because I think it's very tempting that when you get a request or you think about a feature, that you only think about the few next steps that you have. And I always try to figure out, where do we want to go when we can do 2-3 years of development, because then we can scale that back to something that we have right now while keeping our options open, because we know where we want to go. That's sometimes difficult because that usually takes a lot more time. So if you do have to focus on that short term, getting something done, then I start to think about whether something is going to be a system or a feature. And this is actually something that I've been discovering maybe in the past 6 to 12 months for myself, where I've really been able to articulate it. And the difference is a little bit that a feature is something that your users will interact with, and a system is more something that you would build features on top of. So for me, the group module is a great example of a system where Christian van den Einde has done a ton of work to make things around access handling, relationships between different kinds of entities, very performant. But when we first adopted the group module within Open Social, we actually treated it like a feature, where we said anything from that module is a group within our platform. And that actually caused us quite a bit of trouble, because when we wanted to introduce new features, in this case it was a course feature, we thought, hey, we can see the same kinds of logic of user relationships, content relationships that the group module is really good at. But because we had already used it as a feature, there was a lot of rework to make sure that only one bundle, or the specific bundle of group, represented our group feature, while the module remains available for other things. And that's now something we look at much more carefully when we start developing new things, or even when we adopt a contrib module.
I think that's interesting, because I've I've always thought about certain modules that way too, but never explicitly put it to words like that. Because like you have modules like image aspect ratio management, right? Where it just adds a field to an image field, so you can say, hey, this it has to have this aspect ratio, right? And I think in your world, in your terminology, that's a feature. But then you have modules like web form, where there's not just web form, but people will build other web form modules to do specific things. There's ECA, there's group, it used to be rules. They're like modules that are a base that other things will leverage to build in. Is that kind of line up with what you're thinking?
Yeah, pretty much. I think the difficulty that we get at is that it's not really binary, but it's more of a spectrum. And I think for the example of web form, that is something that might be more in the middle, because it provides a system that you can configure to do flexible form building. But there's also specifically a lot of touch points where your users are going to directly interact with behavior that the module has defined, and that may be more prescribed by the module maintainer and less flexible for yourself.
It's interesting. I had a question in the original show notes document about web forms versus core contact forms. And I was like, we don't need to talk about that. I'm actually curious. You touched on something when you were answering your question about product owner and kind of like vision, right? So like, and I think you phrased it perfectly, where it's like, as an architect, your job is to kind of talk to that product owner and kind of understand what the vision is and translate that into technical requirements, right? But I'm wondering, like, how, like, I think you nailed it on the head there, where you said, you sometimes have to look at the long-term vision, right? So like, if you're building, for example, a platform where people are going to be using it over the course of years, as opposed to like a feature where somebody might just use it, once or twice, or they may continue to use it as the product grows. Like, I'm wondering how maybe your thinking and your interaction with the product owner might change there, right? So like, is it something where, when it's a feature, or it's going to be a smaller piece that might not have kind of that long tail, does your approach change at all, as far as like how you interact with the product owner, interact with the design team?
I think it should. I think maybe that's one of my personal flaws, is that I always tend to go for the long-term vision, and I'm lucky to be balanced out by people on my team who push me to go more in the short term. I think there's a balance, in the sense that you of course don't want to over engineer everything. But I don't think I've yet seen a feature where we've built it, where we're thinking like, oh, that's like just this one customer is going to use it. And then someone tells another customer and they'll be like, oh, that looks good, but I just want it slightly different. Like that, I don't think there's really one-off features. So that always keeps me away there. But I think there's a lot of things that you can do within how you build with Drupal as well, to give yourself room there. I think one of the things that we used to do in the past, coming from an agency, is that we would make a lot of use of pre-process hooks and alter hooks to get where we need to go. Because when you're developing, those are really easy to just write a bit of code, get what you need done, talking from a developer perspective. But in the long term, when you find that you want to reuse them or replace them, they're actually pretty sticky, and they start to contain a lot of business logic. And then making sure that you use the proper Drupal primitives, like fields formatters, view displays, form displays. Those are the things that actually give you the flexibility to say, okay, I've built this feature relatively quickly, but the things that are in the feature can be reused for something else, or relatively easily swapped out.
It's interesting, because you hit up there on something that, you know, sometimes I see on my own team where, you know, the developers are very much like, okay, like this solution has to solve, like check every box, and we have to think about, you know, 1 month down the road, 2 months down the road, 2 years down the road. And sometimes I'm just like, no, we don't. We just need an MVP version of this feature to get it out and see if anybody actually uses it, right? So it's interesting to me to hear, you know, your aspect or your point of view on that, because you know, I think that happens for everybody, right? Like sometimes there are certain people that just want all the details and they want to build the most perfect thing, and then like as architects, sometimes I think we have to come in and be like, you know, counsel it in that business logic to be able to say like, nope, we just need this thing out like next week, so that way people can see if it's going to be something they want long term.
Yeah, and maybe the budget part, like don't forget that one, like, because, and I think that this is what we are dealing with every, you know, so you talk about the developers, then you have the technical architects, and then in the end, like you just have a fixed budget or you have some kind of a budget attached to it. And like we can't go forever. But I appreciate like you were talking about how to integrate maybe a feature into your product, which totally would make sense for you to then invest in it, in something that could be like, you know, for it maybe costs only 10, but like if you do it for 20, then, you know, I'm just saying any number, then actually you can get it into the project, into the product, and then resell it.
And Batty, budget and timeline, right? So like a lot of times, like those are also kind of those business criteria where you're like, we need this in like a month, not like, you know, 6 months, right? So
yes.
you know, that can definitely factor in as well.
I think I'm personally definitely sometimes too much in the perfectionist category. I think a question that has helped me with that is to ask, what is the chance that we'll need to revisit this? And also, if we look at, for example, during a pull request review at what was built, but also when evaluating a module for use in the products, and we say, if we want to extend this or we want to build on top of this, how hard is it going to be, and how much work do we have to do? And we also sometimes get it wrong, or even I get it wrong. I gave the team a few weeks ago a direction to say like, hey, I think we should evolve this way, and they came to me with the solution that I asked for, and I actually had to say like, sorry, I sent you the wrong direction. We combined two systems that probably should remain separate, because if we think about how we're gonna evolve that, then that's gonna be a lot more difficult for us, and we had to make the difficult decision to redo some of that work.
I used to have a product owner who used to say that perfection is the enemy of good enough, right? And like you know, those words have, and I haven't worked on this project in probably like 4 or 5 years at this point, but like those words have stuck with me because it's very true. Like, you know, sometimes we want to try to build the most perfect thing, and in reality we just need the thing that's gonna kind of get us to the next level. And you know, Alex, I couldn't agree more. Sometimes we go down the wrong path, and, you know, you got to kind of come back and reset and try again. But
I'm curious about where that line is then for you, Alex, and maybe your organization, because my philosophy is, if something is in core, I want to try to use it. I'll put more effort to extend something in core than I will in contrib. But I definitely try to avoid rewriting something in contrib that already exists just because it's not extensible. But there have been situations where you kind of have to. Like, how much time are you willing to invest in kind of those levels? And when do you kind of fork something and contribute it back separately, or maybe offer to co-maintain a module to make it more extensible? Like, how do you figure out where that line is for a long-running project like Open Social?
I'm not sure I have a clear answer for you. I think it's something we still we try to figure out still as well. We also reevaluate sometimes. I think if I look at an average Open Social installation, we install anywhere between 150 to 300 modules on a site, depending on how complex they are. And those are also a lot of our internal modules. I think we've sometimes split up functionality that should be in a single module across a few different modules because they should have been configuration. But that's slightly tangential. I think one of the challenges is that extending a contrib module and contributing to it also requires you to understand what the module does and how the module works. And what I've seen sometimes is that it's actually easier for developers, if they're already proficient in building with Drupal, to rebuild something rather than to actually use a contrib module. But I think it's so that's the other side of it that you actually want to avoid. I think we generally look at the complexity of the module and the system. If there are specifications like things around authentication, like SAML or simple OAuth, those are definitely things where we would much rather contribute because then other people have looked at it as well. They're security sensitive. If we pay for an audit to get that audited, for example, that's something that feeds back into the community as well. But there's also modules which are sometimes really useful if you're working on a project and you just need a single field. But in those cases, having a single field in a separate module going through the update process, at that point, it might be easier to just copy the fields and maintain that yourself if you don't expect it to change too much.
So I'm curious, Alex, because it's an interesting conversation, and I think the question was good from Nick. Like, when do you extend? When do you use it? So I have used OpenSocial, and we've been using it for some of our clients. And I noticed that you're not just using Layout Builder from core. You're also using paragraphs and other modules that are fitting. So when do you how do you make that decision, or how does that come about that you actually decide, for example, to use these two different versions of how to build layouts and work with content?
So some of it is just time. OpenSocial started development in Drupal 8 Alpha. So in that time, I think the landing page feature is what uses paragraphs, and that predates our dashboard feature by quite a bit. But we were also seeing that the UX of paragraphs just wasn't really what our customers wanted. I think there's been some other modules now that solve that with paragraphs as storage and a more layout builder like UX. But yeah, sometimes it's also just reactionary. You have an experience with one module, like with paragraphs, and then layout builder comes along. We see the nice new UX. We look at it, we say, okay, we need something that's a bit different, so we use it for the next feature we built. And depending on the storage, maybe the next time we might go do something else entirely. And
I'm also excited. About, have you been looking at the Experience Builder initiative?
Not yet. No, I need to, but I haven't had the time yet. No.
As somebody who's using Layout Builder currently on the platform they're building, very interested in how that pans out, because it's going to be, I feel like it's going to be kind of cool. I'm excited about it. So at the beginning of the show, Alex, we talked about in your intro, like sometimes, you educate people as when to not use Drupal, right? And I'm wondering, like, do you find like people come to Drupal with a certain level of requirements for a solution? Like, for example, hey, we're going to use Shopify instead of Drupal Commerce, or some other technology instead of, something that Drupal does either really well or is capable of doing?
So I think where we differentiate or where we deviate from Drupal right now is more where we need capabilities that are not necessarily web. I think for Shopify versus Drupal Commerce, I've used Drupal Commerce personally in the past. It's a really fun set of modules. I think it's really powerful to build a commerce solution with. But I think it's still in that space of I get a web request from a browser, I serve it, I give back a website. Where we see that we're moving in parallel to Drupal is more with things that require real-time processing, like notifications for us is a big one, webhooks to different platforms, especially for webhooks where we start making requests to maybe unknown servers from others. If your request from a user suddenly hangs for 30 seconds because some other server is doing something weird, that's going to give a really bad experience. So you want to isolate that into some other long-running process. And that's not something that Drupal is capable of at the moment. I think that's one of the reasons why async for Drupal is going to be important. But it's also a bit of a shame because it's those kind of solutions where I'm in the JavaScript community and I talk to people and they use services that I'm like, oh, that's really cool SaaS service for many euros a month. But if you look at the base of Drupal, then we're quite close to being able to do the same. But we have to think a little bit beyond what the web gives us and more of what these kind of services behind a website need.
It's one of those things where, like, whenever I advertise the strength of Drupal, right? It's one of those things where I'm like, hey, you know what? Like, Drupal can act as a traffic cop, right? And connect a bunch of disparate systems together, right? To say like, hey, let's take data from this system and, build it into Layout Builder and put it out as a front end theme. And it sounds like Open Social's kind of doing the same sort of thing where you're taking services that may not necessarily be native to Drupal or that Drupal hasn't mastered yet and kind of bringing those in to be able to use them. Is that a fair representation?
Yeah, I think one of the examples was the real-time chat that we built for our SaaS product. One of the requirements that we had was to make sure that all of the user data and the messages was stored within Drupal, because we know that has good access systems, we know it's secure, but one of the challenges is it's a real-time chat. So you need some way to actually push those messages to users. Drupal has support for GraphQL, and GraphQL has something that is called GraphQL subscriptions, which you could use to serve that purpose. But I actually spent quite a bit of time to make a sort of separate PHP application that would be running continuously to manage those subscriptions and act as a bridge between Drupal and the chat client. I would love to be able to just do that with Drupal directly.
Yeah. So Alex, thank you for mentioning this, because I sometimes think like we sometimes have to just talk more, like we are building all the same things and we're trying to solve these solutions. So we've been building we have also a platform that is for au pairs and families, and there is a messenger there involved, and so we are using TieNote. TieNote is an open source, and we can add the link to that in the end, because what we need to do is that you can only do messages if you're like a paying family, and there's also all this stuff that we need to check in the messages. We have to check, like, is there any sensitive data, or are they exchanging telephone numbers, because we want to keep them in the platform. So TieNote instance messaging, tienote.co, TieNote. So that solved that for us, like using that as a service. But anyhow, like talking about a little bit about headless, I'm actually curious, are you in Open Social building headless solutions, or is it mainly like traditional Drupal front end?
We had those plans, but we've had to change our priorities a little bit. So we are not at the moment. Our GraphQL API is something we're actively developing, but mostly aimed at integrating with other systems and client applications, and not necessarily with front end systems. So our front end is currently still just Drupal rendering Twig with a bunch of Ajax sprinkled around in it.
But are you feeling that the clients are like requesting it, that they are like, do you feel like that your clients are, I can say from my side, the clients, they not necessarily care unless there's technical, like we're talking to the IT, then they have maybe requirements of like, this should be headless, or.
I think the customer mostly cares about a modern web experience. And I think one of the things that makes Drupal feel dated is that if you navigate from one page to another, by default, the entire page refreshes. So one of the things I'm looking at that interests me is actually, I would have to look this up specifically, but I think they're called viewport transitions, is a CSS JavaScript web standard that web teams are working on. It might be experimental in Chrome, but what that allows you to do is to describe areas of your page where you can say, like, this area of my page is going to be present on the next page as well. And that lets your browser create these kind of transitions that were previously really only reserved for single page applications.
So
That's
you
interesting.
are you suggesting that web users are paying attention to like a full page refresh versus a partial page refresh?
I think not consciously, but I think in terms of perceived performance, I would be surprised if it didn't.
Sure. Yeah, I can understand that. It's a lot better to have a panel of a page refresh or show an icon than like the whole page, right? But like I guess I never really thought from like an architectural standpoint that an end user would really care whether as long as the page reload was fast, right? Like whether I reloaded the page or if I just reloaded a section of the page. But that's a pretty interesting take.
It's not that they care. It's just that React and stuff, kind of single page apps do that by default. So they're newer, so it feels more modern. I think that's the point.
I guess it's also by default. It also appears faster, right? Like, oh, I didn't have to wait for this whole thing.
I think it depends a little bit on what kind of tool or UI you're building for the user. I think if we look at a marketing website in that context, I think there's the traditional expectation of, oh, it's going to refresh, I'll see the next page, because it's contextually very different. But if you're doing something that might be very data heavy, which I think Drupal is also still really suitable for, maybe you're in a list and you're looking at a detail page for something in that list, then if everything around that list also refreshes, like, it doesn't need to, because the context of where you're working is going to remain the same.
So kind of going back to my question about where the line is, and the answer is probably going to be it depends again, but I'm curious about where your line is for when something should be contributed back to Drupal, right? Because, Drupal's open source. It thrives on the fact that people contribute stuff back. Not everything is necessarily suitable for contribution back if it's very specific, but a lot of things do. But there is a cost there as well, because in order to contribute something back, generally you have to make it a little bit more generic. You have to expect some sort of support. Does OpenSocial have criteria for when something should be contributed back, how much time to dedicate to it?
We don't have specific criteria yet. I think the question is a little bit of, can we make it generic enough? One of the challenges that I've seen over the past 7-8 years of product development is that it's we're a little bit inside of our OpenSocial bubble sometimes when we do development, because there's so much code already there. And that can make it difficult to say, like, oh, this is not going to be something specific to us, but if we take a little bit of effort, we actually do it more. One of the things I'm personally working on is to better map also for ourselves what the differences of these kind of systems versus features we have and where they live. Because one of the things I have in mind, for example, is we have our event feature, and I think there are aspects of that are not necessarily specific to us. And I know there's work in the community also of making event functionality for Drupal websites. But we wrote that event functionality in such a way where it already integrates with all of the other things in OpenSocial. So we would kind of have to do a bit of surgery to extract that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the problems. You sometimes have to do the work twice, right? You have to make the generic implementation and then write the consumer. Whereas if you're just writing custom code, it can be the same module.
Yeah, so you also mentioned the cost, which I think for us is one of the big reasons. So one of my slightly cocky answers has always been that I think we could open source everything, and as a company we would still be successful, because I believe we have enough expertise in what we're doing to stay ahead of other people who might use the same code base. But realistically, the amount of questions we would get and the amount of expectations from people using it would not be something that we can actually support. So I think in the end, everyone is going to be unhappy because they're getting something where they might expect to be able to get help, and we might just not be able to provide that. And we're unhappy because people are asking for help that we cannot provide.
Unless you use that as a business model, like, you know, Centauro has been very successful in like building a lot of commerce sites, but also in the same time like building a lot of modules and helping others that are actually using it. So I think the adoption of Drupal Commerce has partly been due to the fact that Ryan and his team have been so good in actually providing support and actually say like, hey, we do custom development. So I think that you could actually use it, but I totally agree and I understand what you're saying. But I still think that you can totally use it as a, like, to get big, like larger adoption in the end.
I think there's something there. An anecdote that I have is that I went to DrupalCon Prague in 2023, and I was supposed to go with a colleague, but unfortunately he was ill, which forced me. I was going there alone, and one of the things I said was, okay, let's just go to talk to everyone that has a booth. And one of the things that surprised me was that almost everyone that was doing an agency said like, yeah, I have used OpenSocial at some point. But I think one of the things they also all agreed on was that updates with OpenSocial is actually quite difficult. And I know this is partly configuration, but I think it's also that we have some work to do of better outlining like what are the different parts of OpenSocial and how do we expect them to work together. So actually the architecture part. And I think when we can get that done, then those kind of strategies also come back into the picture of saying, okay, open source more or do more custom development.
One of the interesting things that Centauro does too is they have the concept of, I think they call it Commerce Core supported modules. So they have Commerce Core, which is the commerce module, and then they have a suite of modules that are contrib that they also consider part like supported. And then they also have a suite of modules that are just contributed that, you know, they might provide some help, but it's not like guaranteed to be stable with the most recent version of Drupal and the most recent version of Commerce, right? So that might be something that you would consider too. Like if you were to fully open source OpenSocial, you'd have like a couple of tiers. Like the core part is supported. We'll provide help. We'll respond to issues, tickets, whatever. And then maybe there's some more fringe stuff that's like, hey, we'll provide it because we have it, but it's kind of used at your own risk, and it's a much higher. You have to do a lot more work yourself to get something. You know, maybe you'll look at merge requests and merge them in if you know there's tests and stuff, but you're not going to put the work yourself unless you have a client that needs it.
They really have like you know, Batty, it's a great example because like Centauro has really like kind of created a whole ecosystem around Drupal Commerce, right? It's not just like, hey, we're the company that builds and supports the Drupal Commerce module, right? It's like, hey, we're the company, like if you want to get into Drupal Commerce or you want to do commerce with Drupal, like you should come talk to us, right? And you know, they work with, you know, other technical people, right? Other services to integrate that into commerce. You know, I think like PayPal comes to mind, right? I think they support that module pretty heavily. So I mean, I think like it's one of those things where once you get into like an ecosystem sort of vibe, it becomes maybe a little bit easier to say, hey, we're gonna bring this back to the open source community versus like we're just gonna add this feature to, you know, to our product or to our module, because like it's you know, it's kind of a little bit siloed. So
I think so maybe I can ask you all a question, because I think one of the challenges of open sourcing stuff is also versioning and release cadence. If I look at our internal cadence, we have a release every 2 weeks. I believe we mirror that externally. And one of the things that we're actually doing internally is we already had a mono repository, so a single repository for all of our product code. We're actually going to be moving the distribution into that as well, and then using a subtree fork to maintain the open source part. But I think if I look from a product company perspective, ideally we would want to release and deploy multiple times a day to provide updates. But I can also imagine that as a community member, if you're using open source code, if you get a release every day, that's also going to be difficult to keep up with. So I wonder like how you think about that velocity difference, and maybe you see any solutions or ideas there.
I mean,
I don't know if you're like a consumer and there are updates coming every day. I don't know that you ever get used to that. I do think that like those daily releases could be packaged into a weekly, bi-weekly, once a month release, right? That's more manageable, right? And allows you to keep releasing daily. But yeah, I mean, I think the key here is like consistency, right? Like making sure that you say like, hey, we're going to release this every 3 weeks, and it's going to contain all the daily releases from this time period. And like, here are the features that are coming, and here are the updates, and here's what you need to know, right? So it becomes more of an effort of cadence and communication than like, can we do it? Should we do it? Because like ultimately, like, yeah, you probably should if you can.
Yeah, you can just do what Drupal.org does. Use the dev release for the daily, nightly builds, right? And then tag a release every 2 weeks or so. Or when you have something that if there's a security release or something like that that you have to do at a different time, just tag your release. And if people want to be on the nightly, if they want to be on the bleeding edge, or there's a patch that they need to apply, yeah, they can use dev. I use modules where dev does get updated all the time, but I only update them when I need to, right? Whereas, yeah, I think that system would work.
I think it is a great question, Alex. I think it is a great question, and I think there is no right answer to it. I do know that, like, at least from my experience talking to the product companies that are having like the products, they are totally in a daily, hourly releases, right? And why should we not be able to do that? Like, we are stuck in this like really, you know, larger releases, and so I'm a little bit more pro like with the fact of like releasing more often. But I think, you know, we can continue with some of the questions of like how to make decisions of like site building, right?
Yes.
John, you have a good one.
I just wanted to end that if anyone is listening that's using OpenSocial and they're getting worried, don't worry, we'll stick to pretty much the same release cadence. The only change for you is going to be there's going to be one version that we support, and we now support multiple.
I'm actually curious, like now you talked about that you build a lot of things modular in OpenSocial, and you're using these modules, and I think that's how the trend has been. I think like going away from these big distribution ways of building it and then doing it modular. So recipes is going to be the solution that is gonna like make this all much easier. Does that like, how much are you following up on the recipe initiative, and will that change the way how you think about Drupal architecture and how to build things?
So I've been following the initiative for quite a while. Not as closely as I would like, but being tangentially aware of what they're doing. I don't think it's actually going to change what we do at OpenSocial a lot. One of the things that the recipe initiative purposefully left out of their scope was configuration updates. And I think for the target audience of site builders who want to set up a site quickly and then go, that makes a lot of sense, because I think most of the changes that they'll see during updates will come from module updates, which will be updates essentially to the systems of how things work. And they may change configuration, like with views, if there's a new configuration schema, essentially. But one of the things in Open Social is that it's important for us that if we introduce a new feature, that during updates, those features are also going to be shipped. And that is not something that I really see where recipes as an answer. One of the things that does excite me is that I think for modules that are published to Drupal.org, and I think for ourselves, that is going to be something where we have to look at the recipes is going to allow Drupal.org modules to be much more focused on building the systems and allowing the feature aspect of it to be within a recipe that someone can enable on top of it. For me, the best example of this is the book module, because the book module contains quite a bit of great functionality to work with hierarchies of nodes and also to have easy blocks around that and render that tree structure. But what the book module also contains is a book node type. And if you're building a site, you might not want that node type because it can get in the way with other things that you're trying to do. But what recipes enables is it allows the book module to be there and say, like, this is the book system functionality. And here is a recipe where if you want to have a book as functionality, install this recipe, get that node configuration, and off you go. And that is exciting.
Nice.
So, we started off the show by saying there are a bunch of different ways that you can kind of architect things in Drupal, right? And Batty's question just proved that there are new ways coming that you can architect things in Drupal. Alex, I'm wondering, like, how do you learn about new ways of doing things? Like, what are some of the ways that you learn? And then I guess what's your preferred method and why?
It's definitely a challenge. I think I hang out in the Drupal Slack a lot. I read things like the contribute channel, because those are things where people discuss interesting issues before they land in Drupal. And very often there's something like, oh, this looks interesting. Let me just click on it. I might subscribe to it. We've also set up a Slack integration for Drupal's changes list. So whenever a new change record is published, we get a message in Slack. And of course, like reading the release notes, looking at presentations at DrupalCon, following like the initiative's keynotes to see what's going on. Those are all great sources. And of course, the Talking Drupal podcast is also a good way to keep up to date with what's coming and what's going on.
Can you tell me more? I've never heard of this podcast. Is it any good?
So they're apparently already at episode 457. So I think they've been around the block a few times and are a very good podcast.
Well, I appreciate the compliment. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right on with like DrupalCon presentations, and I think one of the ways that I kind of hear about new things too is the weekly drop. I tend to get the newsletter and go through it, and I'm like, oh, look at this deprecation, or look at this change, and I'm like, oh, look at that. And I will say that Martin at the top of the show educated me to the fact that now via the services YAML file, I can shut off kind of the global admin access. I had missed that in the releases. So yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those landscapes that's changing and always changing, I guess. And like, you got to always try to keep up with it the best you can.
I think we have time for one last question. Your Drupal.org username is King Dutch. Are you the king of the Netherlands?
So I think I've had that username since I was 7 or 8. So I'm not entirely clear on why this was the name, but it's registered everywhere I go. So I stuck with it. I suspect the king, now king of the Netherlands, is called Willem Alexander. So Alexander is part of it. And of course, I'm Dutch. So 1 + 1 is 2.
So I'm curious, you say that like you had this username since you were 7 and you've been on Drupal.org for 12 years. That means that you're only 19 now or 18? No, 19, 20?
This username was used in many places on the internet before I brought it to Drupal.org. No.
Because Alex, you have an impressive, I'm on your Drupal.org /u/King Dutch, and you have an impressive contribution list. So thank you for being such a good Drupal contributor and like, I don't know, 447 fixed issues on Drupal.org and maintaining a lot of projects. So great profile.
Thank you.
What Alex is saying is King Dutch is like Web Guy 214 on AOL. Yep, old school.
I just missed AOL, but I have been on MSN. So.
Nick, do you remember your IRC number?
The Drupal IRC number?
No, just it wasn't IRC the one that always had your username was like a number.
Oh no, wasn't that ICQ?
ICQ, that was it. Sorry,
so
I do not remember
actually where you also have a nickname, where I also would be King Dutch.
Wow, look at that.
Before I used Drupal, so yeah.
Well, Alex, as always, thank you for joining us. We promise to try to get you back in less than 100 episodes. But thank you for joining us and contributing to the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Do you have questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on the Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel. You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD-promo. And you can get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter. Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing that Become a Patron button in the sidebar. All right, everyone. We've gotten to that point in the show where you're going to tell all of our listeners how they can get a hold of you if they want to learn more about what you do. So, Alex, if somebody wants to learn more about Open Social or your many contributions to the Drupal community, how can they go about doing that? So if you want to learn more about Open Social, there's getopensocial.com. If you want to learn more about me, there's alexandervarwijk.com. That also lists all of my talks at previous conferences, including one at GraphQL Galaxy where I did shortly described how I did that subscription thing for GraphQL. And from there, you can also find all my other social platforms. Fabulous. Batty, what about you?
Yeah, so I'm Batty Sonia on probably all profiles from LinkedIn to Drupal to X and the others. And at the moment, a large team, part of the OneX team is at Dev Days. So Dev Days is happening this week when we are recording this. So it's happening in Burgas in Bulgaria. And there's a lot of people coming there together to talk about Starshot and other things. And of course, 11 and more. Apart from that, like you can find me at DrupalCon Barcelona happening in the end of September, and the early bird rate is going to be ending now soon. So make sure you get your ticket. And we've heard that there's a lot of excitement about DrupalCon Barcelona. I'm
always very excited about DrupalCons. I never get outside of the US, unfortunately. I will try to endeavor to do that, but always very excited about DrupalCons. Nick Laughlin, where can folks find you? You can find me pretty much everywhere at NixVan, NICXVAN. And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks as well as Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out more about EPAM at EPAM.com. And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.